Firewalls like OPNsense are essential for IT security, but sometimes they can be too secure. For instance, if your firewall crashes, then yes, you have a very secure network, but now nobody can access anything. In which case, you'll want to have a redundant firewall to protect against outages and help with maintenance. But how do you set up redundancy for OPNsense? Well, if that's something you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, as that's what we'll be going over. Now, as this video is specifically about setting up redundancy, I'm going to assume you already have OPNsense installed on 2 devices, or you at least know how to install OPNsense. If not, then I do have another video which shows you how to install OPNsense on a virtual machine, for instance. In addition, I don't advise watching this video for the first time and making changes as we go along. Changing a firewall can result in unexpected problems just because the MAC address has changed, for instance, and some devices may not play well with this new setup, and the last thing you need is to be stuck trying to fix problems. So, to be prepared, I'd suggest to watch the video first to at least get an understanding of what's involved, then test this in a lab before arranging something like this in a live environment. Now, in a very basic network, where you've got one single firewall, this is typically what it's going to look like. In other words, we've got 2 networks either side of a firewall, and the default gateway for the network is assigned to the actual interface of the firewall. So in this case, it's .254. Now, when it comes to redundancy, at least in terms of OPNsense, we're going to have 2 firewalls. One's going to be the primary, one's going to be the backup. But each has its own unique IP address. So for the primary firewall, it's .253, and for the backup, it's .252. There is still a default gateway of .254, which is the same as what we were using for just a single firewall, except this is a virtual IP address, so it doesn't actually belong to either firewall as such. It'll float between the 2 firewalls depending on which one's active. So what you'll have at any given time is one firewall is active, the other one is just sitting there in standby or passive. So let's say the primary firewall is the active firewall. Then when the LAN PC over here sends traffic to .254, it's the primary firewall that will pick that traffic up, and then if it's allowed through, it'll forward it over to the wide area network over here that we've got. Likewise, when the actual WAN PC sends its response back to 254, it'll get picked up by the primary and then forwarded back over to the LAN network. Now, if this firewall were to go down, become inoperable for some reason, then what happens is the backup firewall detects that and it takes responsibility for that .254 default gateway. So it's basically just transitioning over to this firewall. And that's the benefit, is that that IP address can literally just move backwards and forwards between the 2 firewalls, and that's what gives us the actual redundancy. So you've got to bear in mind that each firewall needs its own unique IP address assigned to an interface. Both of the firewalls need an actual network interface in each of these networks that have to be identical in that respect. The only difference is going to be the IP address assigned to them. Now, one other thing I'll point out is that although it's not mandatory or essential, shall we say, it is recommended to have a dedicated link between the 2 firewalls. The reason being is that the primary firewall here has to keep the backup firewall up to date. So normally what will be happening is traffic will be passing through the firewall and it'll be keeping a state table up to date. It has to keep the backup firewall up to date with that information. Likewise, when there's any configuration changes made on the primary firewall, and they should only get made on that primary firewall, they'll get synchronized over to the backup firewall. So it isn't mandatory, but it is strongly recommended that you have that dedicated link to have that traffic so that there's no interruption. It also makes it secure, because especially when you're exchanging configuration information between the firewalls and state information as well. So that's the way this actually works, is 2 firewalls where they're using a virtual IP address between them, and it's only the active firewall that actually handles that default gateway. So one firewall acts as the actual active firewall, the other one sits in a standby state waiting to take over. Now, configuring redundancy for OPNsense is going to be the same no matter what. The only thing is the actual strategy that you use to, say, transition from a single firewall here to having a redundant pair of firewalls, because it depends on the situation. But in this video, what we're going to do is to actually repurpose the original firewall. The assumption being that, yes, we can get an additional firewall to give us the redundancy, but we can't get that second firewall to make life easy. We've got to use the difficult path of rebuilding the original. So what we're going to be doing in this video is to take a backup of the original firewall, and then what we're going to do is to restore that onto the new firewall, and that'll become the primary firewall once we've got that configured to do all of our redundancy. The benefit of that is that, well, we can make changes to this firewall without doing any interruption to the existing network, because we'll do this offline. And then when we're ready, we'll just swap the firewalls over. So then what we'll be left with is a new primary firewall which has got the same rules, and it'll answer to the same original default gateway. So it should go a lot more smoother than maybe reconfiguring the original, for instance, to support redundancy on the fly. And the other benefit is that if anything actually goes wrong when we introduce this new firewall, we can revert back to the original firewall. And then once we've done our testing and we're confident enough that the actual firewall is actually working as expected, what we can do is then go back to the original firewall, and then we'll rebuild that one as the backup firewall. And then once that's back on the network, we'll have these two running as a pair of redundant actual firewalls. So the strategy in that case, I'd say, is it's less intrusive. We've got much smaller downtime, but it still allows us to transition from that single firewall to a redundant pair. Now I've logged into a computer which is on the LAN side of the network, and that's allowed me to connect into the existing firewall, which is 10.1.2.254 on this LAN side. I've also actually installed OPNsense onto another firewall. I've gone as far as installing the operating system, going through the actual setup wizard, and that's completed the actual setup process, but that's all I've done. Now the IP address that I've assigned to it doesn't really matter too much as long as it's unique on the network and doesn't cause any conflicts. And I say that because what we're going to do is take a backup of the existing firewall and then restore it onto the new firewall, in which case the IP address here is going to change anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But before we actually take a backup, what we're going to do is check that the version of the firmware is the same. So on the new firewall, 24.1, and on the existing one, 24.1. I strongly suggest you do make sure that they're running the same version, because if you take a copy of the actual backup on the existing firewall and restore it onto your new firewall, but the software versions are different, you could run into a situation where you've got bugs, compatibility problems, and so on, that mean basically the new firewall doesn't work as expected. So do check the actual software versions first. And then what we're going to do is take a copy of this firewall's configuration. So we'll go to System, go to Configuration, and then Backups. Then we've got this Download section to download a copy of the actual configuration. In a production environment, it would make sense to select the option to encrypt the configuration file, put in your password and confirm that, but this is just a lab. The actual firewall, it only exists for the purpose of the video anyway, so it's not that important for me. In which case, next thing you do is click on Download Configuration, and then you'll either get prompted and ask where do you want to store this, or as in here, it automatically gets downloaded to the actual downloads folder. So one final thing I'll point out is that all I've got here is a basic firewall. If you've got any packages installed, you'll need to back those up. Now, there's just too many of them for me to cover, and how you actually back those up really depends. So some will have their own backup option. For some, you'll have to take an actual screenshot of the configurations. And if you've got any packages, you'll then have to install them onto the new firewall and then either restore their configs or manually put in those settings. But in the case of this video, I'm keeping things as simple as possible. So we're just doing a complete backup of the actual firewall itself here. Now, before we go any further, it's best to isolate this new firewall, because we'll be restoring a configuration onto that firewall and it'll end up with the same IP addressing as the existing firewall. And if they're in the same network, it'll cause a conflict and you'll end up with outages. So how you actually isolate the firewall depends on the situation. In a physical environment, we're talking about cable changes, maybe plugging it into a completely separate network switch, for example. And while you could do something similar on hypervisors, for instance, you could add a new actual bridge, a new actual virtual switch. The problem is making changes to the hypervisor is a bit more impacting than what we're going to do next, which is to just simply change the VLAN tags on the virtual machines. All we're actually affecting then is the actual virtual machines and nothing else. There's less likely of a chance of something going wrong. So I'm using Proxmox VE here, and to update this new firewall, just selecting that firewall, going to hardware, and then I'm just going to select the actual interfaces, click edit. Now, I'm not using anything at all in the 2000 range, and there is quite a range for VLANs, but since 2000 is not used, I'm going to change the tag from 301 to 2301, and I'm just going to update all of these by putting a 2 in front of them. So this will put the actual network interfaces of this virtual machine in completely different VLANs to what the existing firewall and all the other computers are in. Now, I do still need access to this firewall to be able to make changes to it. So I'm going to do the same for my LAN virtual machine I'm using. So I'm going to edit that, and I'll put that in 2301, because 2301 is going to be the LAN side for this network. So that's it. I've now isolated this firewall into the 2000 range, whereas the original firewall is still in that original range there. So they're completely isolated from each other. And now I should be able to make changes to the new firewall. So we're back on our computer, which is on the LAN side, and it's now in a completely different network to where it was originally, and so is the new firewall. So on this tab here where we're connected into the original firewall, if I click on the refresh option, eventually it's going to time out. In other words, we can't get access to it anymore. There you go. If I go back to the new firewall on the other hand, click on the refresh button, we can connect to it. So at least we know we're isolated now from the existing network, and our computer still has access to the new firewall. So what we're going to do next is to actually restore our configuration file. So we're going to go to System, Configuration, and then Backups. And then we've got an option to restore. Now, there's various things you can do here to choose what to restore. I'm just going to leave it as the default, which is to restore everything. Click on Browse, and then I'm going to go to Downloads, select my file. Now, you do need to tell it if you've actually encrypted the file. If you do, it'll ask you for the password. I haven't. So I'm just going to click on Restore Configuration, and then off it'll go. It'll eventually reboot itself, and we'll just wait for it to come back up. Well, the new firewall is now back up and running, and I have logged into it, except I pointed to 10.1.2.254. The reason being is, well, this is more or less a clone of the original firewall. Same IP addressing, same name, and so on. So there's no point pointing to 10.1.2.252 because, well, this configuration's now been overwritten. Now, when I say it's a clone, at hardware level, it's still different MAC addressing and so on. But from a firewall perspective, we've got the same functionality, or at least in terms of OPNsense itself. So if you've got any packages running on the existing firewall, like I was suggesting before, you should have really taken a backup copy of those where possible. And then the plan is you would now actually restore those onto this. By that, we're talking about installing the actual packages and then either manually configuring it or restoring the configuration depending on the package. But now basically what we've got is a firewall that's configured the same as the original firewall. it has actually been isolated from the network. So I can now start making changes to this firewall without impacting any of the users that are out there on the network. I'm not going to be making changes to the existing firewall. I'm going to be setting this new firewall up so that it's ready for redundancy. Now, before we add any redundancy to this firewall here, there are some initial changes that need to be made first. So for one thing, if we look down here in the bottom right hand corner under interfaces, the IP address for the default gateway is assigned to the actual interfaces, so we do need to change that. So I'm going to go over to interfaces, and then I'm going to select WAN. Now, technically, the order I do this in doesn't really matter. It just means when I actually change the actual IP addressing to the LAN, I'll get disconnected. So I'm just going to leave that till last. But I'll scroll down. Now, this is going to be the primary firewall, and I've assigned .253 to that. So I'm changing this to .253. Click on Save, and then click Apply Changes. Then just wait for that to actually take effect. And then I'll go over to the LAN interface and I'll do the same there. Now, at this stage, I'll stop and say, make sure that you've actually got console access, because by changing the actual IP addressing here, you always run the risk of actually locking yourself out. So make sure you've got console access so that you can at least get into there and make changes within the console before you actually commit to making any changes here through the GUI. So I'm just going to change that to .253 and click Save. It takes me right back up to the top again, so I'll click Apply Changes. Now, in this particular case, because we're logged in to 10.1.2.254, it should eventually time out. I mean, it'll apply the change, but then it'll keep trying to get access to .254 and it'll fail. Now, what I've found is it's best not to keep that entire URL and try to connect that way, because the firewall tends to complain if you try to connect to an existing session, if you will, using a different IP address. It doesn't seem to like that. So for that reason, I'm going to use .253, except now it's decided timeout. So I'll point it to 253, and then I'll need to log back in again. So both of the IP addresses on these interfaces are now .253, which is good. Now, another thing I want to do is to actually change the name of the firewall. I mean, I could have a firewall 1, a firewall 2, doesn't really matter, but I'm going to change this just to keep it in sync with the documentation that I've got. So I'm going to click on System, Settings, I'll go down to General, and then I'm just going to change this to, well, this one's going to be the primary. So this is primary FW, primary firewall. Click on Save. And that's the name change applied. So just go back to the dashboard. And then for consistency, I just need to make the same change within the actual hypervisor as well. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply if you're using physical firewalls, and how you actually change the name of a virtual machine really depends on the hypervisor. In my case, I'm using Proxmox VE. So to change the name of this firewall, I'm going to go to Options, and then I'm going to select the name right at the top here, click Edit, and I'm going to change this over to Primary FW. Click OK, and now I've got the actual name of the firewall itself in line with the actual name that I've got here configured within the hypervisor. Now, the main part of redundancy for OPNsense is CARP, or Common Address Redundancy Protocol. And that's something that it gets from the underlying operating system for FreeBSD. So to set up CARP, we're going to go to Interfaces, then Virtual IPs, and click on Settings. And then what we're going to do is to create some virtual IPs for each of the networks that the firewall is actually responsible for. So we'll click on the plus sign here. We're going to change the mode to CARP. Now I'm going to change the actual interface to WAN, and then I'm going to put in the actual IP address, which for this network is 10.1.1.254/24. In other words, if you look at the example, it wants this inside a format. So that's the IP address followed by the subnet mask. Now, we then got an option for a password. So we're going to put one in. Basically because the firewalls are going to be exchanging information using CARP over interfaces, and anything that's on those networks has the potential to be listening to that information. So you've got to put some security in. In this case, we use a password. Then once a VHID group, which can go from 1 to 255. So you can either type that in or click the button here to select an unassigned one. So because this is the one that we first set up, it's assigned a number of 1. Now, bear in mind, because it goes from 1 to 255, you can't line this up with VLANs probably, unlike say Cisco's HSRP version 2, which goes through the entire range of VLANs. But, well, if there's even just a tiny bit of OCD in you, you could argue that you could line it up with a third octet. 1, 1. Just saying, it's possible. Anywho, the next thing we need to do is to put in the ADV base. So this is basically the advertising frequency. So one thing I'll point out is this is slightly different to what you're seeing in the current documentation, or at least what I've saw anyway. They've got it configured slightly different, but in this particular version, nope, there's bits in there that are missing. All I can put here is the actual advertising frequency. Now by default it's 1. It can go from 1 to 255, so this is just how often they're going to be exchanging these CARP messages between your firewalls. If you find out that having problems, maybe the actual firewall can't cope, it's too often, you can increase that number, but I'm just going to stick with a default here of 1. But do make sure that this lines up on both firewalls. They both have to be transmitting at the same time, with the same frequency. Then for the actual description, I'm just going to call it a WAN VIP and then click on Save. I then need to set up one for the LAN, so I'll click on the plus sign, change the mode to CARP. It's already picked out the LAN interface, so I can leave that as is. So this is going to be 10.1.2.254. I can type and then /24. Put in a password for this one. It then wants the VHID group, so I'm going to click the button. Let's pick to 2. Just saying. ADV base, I'm just going to leave that at 1. And then for the description, I'm just going to call this a LAN VIP. Now, one thing I will mention is that we've got a different VHID group. So on the WAN side, it's 1. On the LAN side, it's 2. And that's in keeping with what the documentation says. I mean, I suppose you could argue that you could use the same number on all of the interfaces. It's just that you run into the potential problem where maybe you've got 2 systems on the same network, both running CARP. So you might have one redundant pair in front of another redundant pair. And if they're both running CARP and they're both using the same group, well, yeah, it's going to cause problems. They'll conflict with each other. So I suppose the safest thing to do is stick with what the actual documentation says and just try to keep these numbers totally unique. Anyway, I'm going to click on Save, and that sets up the LAN VIP. And then I'm going to click Apply as it suggests for these changes to take effect. Now, if you have a firewall which is using NAT, or Network Address Translation, and most typically do because they're facing the internet, then what you're going to find is that NAT, at least by default, is actually going to get in the way of your high availability. So by that I mean that, for instance, in the case of this firewall, traffic will come in from the LAN interface, exit the WAN interface, but it'll be assigned an IP address of 10.1.1.253. In other words, the IP that's assigned to the interface. Now, that's not going to work with our failover. It needs to be coming out with the IP address of the VIP. So we need to change the NAT rules. Now, before I do that though, I'm actually going to create an alias first. The reason being is that, as far as I can tell, I can't create one rule and actually select multiple subnets or networks within that rule. I have to set up multiple rules, but to make life easier, if I set up an alias, I can then use that alias within the NAT rule. Then I just have to keep updating the alias going forward. So that does seem a bit easier to manage. So what we're going to do is click on Firewall, then Aliases. Then we're going to click on Plus. I'm just going to call this one, say, NAT subnets, change the type to networks, because that's what I'm going to put in the content field here. So I've only got one, which is 10.1.2.0/24. I'll hit return. And then at this point, I'd start entering more of the actual subnets if I had any other internal networks. That's the only one I've got for this video, but that's just something to bear in mind. So the idea is you just keep this alias up to date going forward. And then for the actual description, I'm just going to say this is networks needing one NAT, for example. And then click apply. And then we can reconfigure NAT. So we click on NAT, click on outbound. We're going to change it from automatic to manual, and then click on save. Click apply. Then I'm going to create a new rule. Now, the interface depends on what the exit interface is. In this case, it's already picking out one, so we can leave that as is. There's other things you can change because you can be very, very selective in terms of the traffic that gets natted through the actual interface. You can do that as part of security, for instance. In my case, I'm just leaving it down to the actual source address here. So instead of having this set to any, I'm going to have it set to the NAT subnets alias that I created. And then for the translation target, rather than the interface address, I'm going to pick out that one VIP. I can give it a description if I like, but I'm just going to click save and then click that to apply changes. So I've now got an actual rule here, which should translate anything coming through the firewall that exits the WAN interface, but has this actual, well, at least one of these subnets that's in the alias, to this IP address when it leaves. So what we can do is actually check that. If I go to my computer here, I'm just going to check that I can get access to a computer I've got on the other side of the actual firewall, which is 10.1.1.40. So that works. So I'm going to SSH over to that actual computer. And just log in. So I've been able to get access to this computer, but if I put in who, it's actually showing me the IP address that I've actually got logged in with. So it's actually showing the correct IP address. So it is working. So instead of the IP address being the IP address of the interface, it is now the actual VIP. And that's exactly what we want. It means that any connection that's coming through the active firewall will still be able to work if there's a failover to the other firewall. Now, although it's not mandatory, it is strongly recommended to set up a dedicated network connection between your two firewalls. That way the primary can send HA and sync traffic across to the backup with little interruption. So this firewall does have a spare interface, so we're going to set that up. So I'm going to click on interfaces and then assignments. I've only got one interface to choose from in the list anyway, but then I'm going to click add. Then I'm going to click that interface. We're going to enable it. Then we're going to give it some meaningful name. So I'm just going to call it HA link. I'm using IPv4, so I'm going to change it from none to static IPv4. And then I need to put in an IP address. So this needs to be something that isn't being used anywhere else on the network. You don't want traffic coming from a data network, for example, to clash with this range. Otherwise, the firewall won't be able to actually send traffic back to that actual network, for instance. Now, all the other interfaces I've got are in the 10/8 network range. I've got no plans on using 192.168. So for that reason, I'm going to set this to 192.168.0.253. In other words, I'm at least going to keep that fourth octet in sync with all the other interfaces. Now, what you use for the subnet mask depends. Sometimes in companies, it'll be /31. More typically, it'll be a /30. In my case, it really doesn't matter. In which case, I'm just going to stick with a simple /24 here. Then click on save. And then click apply changes. So once it sets that up, I'll go back to the lobby, go back to dashboard. I've now got an actual link that I can use as my HA link. Now, your typical firewall is going to block most, if not all, traffic on a newly created interface. And we've just set one up for an actual dedicated connection between our firewalls, meaning we're going to have to set up some rules to allow the traffic through. So to do that, we're going to click on Firewall, then we'll click on Rules, then we need to pick out our actual HA link firewall interface here. We'll then click on plus to add a new rule. Now, if you go through the documentation, they'll suggest just basically setting up a rule to allow all traffic through, but I'm not overly comfortable with that. I'd rather put a bit more security than just allowing anything. So what I'm going to do is to change the protocol here to pfSync. And then for the source, I'm just going to set it to the network range for this interface. Then for the description, I'll set this to pfSync traffic and then click Save. Now, you can be a lot more secure than that if you want to. Just bear in mind that the destination is a multicast range, and also you're dealing with a situation where the primary firewall here has one address, the backup has a different address, and what's going to happen is the configuration from the primary will get copied across as is to the secondary, so you'd have to be very careful about what you set as the source address, because you might allow traffic from the primary but not necessarily from the actual backup, so bear that in mind. Now, as well as the actual pfSync traffic, the primary is actually going to update the backup with its config by actually logging in just like you or I do using the web interface here. So I need to add another rule to allow that traffic through. So I'm going to change the actual protocol to TCP. I'm going to change the source to HA link net again. And then the port range, well, it's HTTPS. So I'll select that. It automatically updates the to field there. Then for the description, I'm just going to set this to GUI traffic. Scroll down, click on Save. So we've got the two types of traffic that we need to allow across the link, and then click on Apply Changes for that to take effect. Now, you might be wondering about the CARP traffic. So that's to do with the actual virtual IP address that gets shared between firewalls. Well, that's going to get exchanged on the LAN interface and the WAN interface, for example. But if you look up here on any interface, really, when you're getting these automatically generated rules, click on the drop-down menu, and lo and behold, we've got CARP traffic is already being allowed. I didn't have to do that. The firewall's doing it by default. And it's allowing traffic for IPv6 as well as IPv4, so that's already in place. So as far as the extra firewall rules go, they're the only two that we need to add. Now, to complete the redundancy configuration on our primary firewall here, we need to set up HA sync and pfSync. And this is to actually keep the backup firewall up to date. So to do that, we're going to click on System, and then on High Availability, and click Settings. Now, this section up here under General Settings is for pfSync. It's for synchronizing state tables. So at a minimum, we want to select that option, Synchronize States. You then need to tell it what interface to use, and there's a drop-down menu to select the right interface. In my case, it's already picked the one that I want to use, so I'll leave that as is. And then it wants the IP address of the backup firewall. In this case, I am only running two firewalls, so I'm going to put the actual IP address in, although here it's suggesting a multicast IP address. So I'm just going to put 192.168.0.252, which is the IP address we'll be configuring on the new backup firewall. Then what follows is the config for HA sync. So this is for actually keeping the configuration up to date on the backup firewall. Again, it wants the IP address of our firewall, so I'm copying and pasting that because it's going to be the same. It then wants some login details that I can use to actually log into the backup firewall. So unless you've added a new user account, then typically that's just going to be root, then whatever that password is, assuming I can type. And then what you've got to do is actually select the actual items to do with configuration that you actually want to replicate across to your actual backup firewall. And what you actually select here really depends on what you're using. So at a bare minimum, what we want is virtual IPs. We will want firewall rules, which is lowered down here. We will also want aliases and NAT. I think it would be a lot easier if this has been in like alphabetical order, for instance. I'm not sure what the ordering is here, but yeah, it can be a bit of a pain to pick things out. But that's usually the bare minimum that you want. Anything else really depends on your circumstances. So if, for instance, you're using a DHCP server, then you'll want DHCPD and so on. And there's quite a few different things. Probably doesn't make sense to replicate all of them. It just really depends on what it is you're actually using. Now, in my case, I'm going to be setting up a new widget on the dashboard, in which case I wanted to synchronize the dashboard as well. So I'm just going to go through these and just double check I've got everything I need. That seems to be okay. And then click save. And that's it. That gets the pfSync part configured, plus the HA sync. Now, there is a status option here where you can actually check the status, but at this stage there isn't a backup firewall in place, so there's not really much point clicking that. So that's as far as we need to go in terms of configuring this firewall. Now at this stage I would suggest doing as much testing as you possibly can, because what we're going to be doing next is to swap out the original firewall for the new one. So I've just got a very basic setup here where I've got one actual computer on the other side of the firewall. So I'm going to check to make sure I can at least reach that computer. So at least I know traffic is passing through the firewall from one side to the other. I'm then going to log into the actual computer. Reason being is I actually want to check if NAT's working. So if I just do who, it's saying I've logged in with this IP address. So that's the IP address of the VIP. So at least I know that the actual NAT portion's working. But the other tests you do really depend on your circumstances. I mean, if you've got packages installed, for example, you'll want to check that they're all working properly before you consider swapping out your original firewall. Now, what we want to do now is to replace the existing firewall with the new firewall. The only trouble is both of these firewalls have got the same IP addressing, so they can't exist on the same network. So the first thing we're going to do is to actually isolate the existing firewall from the network. Just bear in mind, as soon as we do that, well, it's going to cause an outage. So you're going to have to give people plenty of notice that this network basically is going to stop working, because nobody will be able to get access to anything because the firewall is gone. So there's different ways you can do that. But what I'm going to do for this firewall is just to update the actual VNIX, because this is a virtual firewall running on a Proxmox VE server. So to do that, I'm going to go to hardware, and then I've got 3 network interfaces, and what I'm going to do is just change the VLAN on each one of them. So I'm going to select the first one, click edit. Now I'm not using anything in the 3000 range, so that's what I'm going to do is just put all of these interfaces into a 3000 and something VLAN. So for this one, I'm just putting 3 in front, so it now goes into VLAN 3301. Click OK. Then I'm just going to do the same all of the other interfaces that we've got on this firewall. Now with Proxmox VE, this is all getting done on the actual fly, but yeah, now that we've actually moved all of these interfaces to different VLANs, well, that's it. We've now got a network outage, so that's something to bear in mind. Make sure that everybody's well aware of this change before you even start. Well, now that the original firewall has been isolated from the network, I can bring the new one online. So this is a virtual machine running in Proxmox VE, and what I'm going to do is to update the VLAN tags. So I'm going to go to hardware and then pick an interface, click edit. Now to isolate this one, I was putting all of the actual interfaces into the 2000 VLANs. So I just need to remove the 2 to bring these back onto the actual live network. And again, it's just going to do these on the fly. So I'll just do the last one, and that should put this firewall onto the live network. So just check. Yeah, none of these are still in the 2000 range. Now, the computer that I'm using is still in an isolated network, so I need to update its VLAN tag as well. So that way I can still configure this new firewall. So now we should have the original firewall isolated into these 3000 VLANs. The new firewall is back onto the live network, and so is my computer that I can use to manage the firewall. Well, now that the new firewall has been activated, it's time to do more testing. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make sure I've actually got access to this new firewall. So the new one's got an IP address of 10.1.2.253, and that's what we've got in the browser. Click on refresh. Yep, that's still working. If we go to dashboard, for instance, well, I can move around. If we go to interfaces, virtual IPs, status, I can see the two VIPs are up and that they're configured as the default gateway that we want to be using on our network. So that's all a good sign. I mean, if I try to actually connect to 10.1.2.254, for instance, just to double check. Yeah, it's got the name of our new primary firewall, so that's all good to see. So at this stage, it would be a case of handing it over to users and making sure everything works, basically. But this is just a basic lab that I've got. So I'm going to try and connect to a computer on the other side of this firewall, which, yep, that's responding to ping requests. I'm going to try and SSH into that one. Provide my password. So I'm just double checking again. Yeah, NAT's working as expected. So it all looks to be working fine. The only thing I'll say at this stage is it really depends on your circumstances. You can run into all sorts of problems just by changing the MAC address, which is what we've done here. I mean, this firewall's got the same configuration, but deep down at a hardware level, the MAC address has changed. That can cause problems for some devices. In other words, whereas some actual computers will be quite happy to just accept that MAC address has changed, others will have security features and they'll just refuse to accept the different MAC address, and then they won't be able to connect. So you might have to flush ARP tables, CAN tables, and so on. If you've got any network security features set up, you might have to update those with the new MAC address and so on. So at this stage, how things work or don't work really depends on your situation. In my case, this is just a very, very simple lab. A couple of Linux computers that are being used, and they're quite happy with this MAC address changing, but these are things you do have to bear in mind. Now, unless you've got two new firewalls to set up your redundancy, then you're going to have to reconfigure the original one. So for that reason, I've moved my computer into a VLAN that will give me access to the original firewall, and as you can see, this session to the new firewall is timed out. So I'm going to open up a new tab, and I'm going to point to the IP address for the actual original firewall, and then I need to log into that firewall. And that's a good sign because the name is the name of the original firewall. I can still double check if I click on interfaces, go down to virtual IPs, click on status. Well, there's no VIPs mentioned here, and I know that's a good sign because the original firewall didn't have any VIPs actually configured on it. So as far as I can tell, I am actually on the original firewall. So what I need to do is to change the actual IP addresses on the interfaces. So I'm going to click on WAN, scroll all the way down. I'm going to change this from 254 to 252, click save, and then click apply changes. Then just need to wait for that to take effect. Now, if you've got any other interfaces, it's a case of repeating that same process because we can't have the default gateway actually assigned to the interface. Now, the only one that's left for me is the LAN interface, so I'll select that, scroll down, change that, click on save, then click apply changes. The only thing is I'm actually logged in that .254 address, so I'm going to lose connectivity. So for that reason, I'm going to point it over to 252 instead. And while that's going on, as far as we can tell, I mean, eventually it'll time out because it's still trying to connect. I've been able to quickly sneak a connection in on the new IP address, but I'm just double checking that all of the interfaces that I've got have now got the IP address that should be assigned to this firewall. But while we're here, I'm going to change the name as well, because I want this to be the backup firewall. So I'm going to System, then we go to Configuration, no, we go to Settings, then we go to General. Then I'm going to change this to be the backup firewall. Click on Save. And we just go back to the lobby and then to the dashboard. We've now got our new name for this firewall. Now, because this is a virtual firewall, it's going to make sense for me to keep the actual name on the firewall in sync with what we've got configured here on my hypervisor, Proxmox VE. So we select the firewall, go to Options, click on Name at the top, click on Edit, and then I'm going to change this over to Backup Firewall. And now the two are in sync. Well, we should now be able to move our original firewall back to the live network, and although it shouldn't cause any problems, it's best just to warn users ahead of potential problems just in case. Now, for me, this is a virtual firewall and it's running on Proxmox VE. So what I need to do is to update the VLAN tags. To do that, I click on the virtual machine, go to Hardware, and then pick out one of the actual interfaces. So I put these interfaces into a 3000 and something VLAN, so I just need to delete that 3 at the front. And I need to do that for all of the actual interfaces. So I'm just going to repeat that for all of these, and that's it. It should have put this back onto the live network. Now, I'm using a PC to do all of my management, so I need to move that one as well. So that one needs to be in VLAN 301 in my case. But we should now have a backup firewall that's ready to be configured on the live network. Now, in order for us to have redundancy, we're going to have to configure pfSync on this backup firewall here. But before we do that, we're going to set up a dedicated link for it. Now, like I was saying with the primary firewall, it isn't mandatory that you actually have a dedicated link between the two firewalls, but it is strongly recommended. That way the two firewalls can exchange their information without getting interrupted by other devices on the network. So to do this, we're going to go to Interfaces and click Assignments. Now, I've only got one spare actual interface on this computer, but if you had any others and you needed to pick a different one, just click on the drop-down menu and select the appropriate interface. Then it's a case of clicking Add, and then we can click on the actual link for that new interface. We'll enable it. Change the description to something useful, so I'm going to just call this HA link. I'm using IPv4, so I'm going to change this from none to static IPv4. Then I'm going to scroll down and enter the IP address. So for me, it's 192.168.0.252. And then I need to change the subnet mask as well, which for me is just a /24 network. Then I can click on Save. And then I need to click Apply Changes for this to take effect. And then once that's done, if I go back to the lobby and then to Dashboard, we can see our new interface for our HA link down here in the bottom right corner. Now the next thing to do is to configure pfSync on our backup firewall. So to do that, we'll click on System, then on High Availability, and then we'll click Settings. We need to enable the option Synchronize States, and then you need to pick the proper synchronization interface that you're going to be using. So in my case, it's already picked out the correct one, but otherwise you can just click on the drop-down menu and select whichever interface is relevant for you. And then we need to put in the IP address of the actual primary firewall. So for me, it is 192.168.0.253. Now, as the documentation suggests, that's as far as you need to go when it comes to the backup firewall. So on the actual primary firewall, we set up HAsync, but that isn't relevant to the backup firewall. All it needs is pfSync. The HAsync is for the actual primary firewall to synchronize its configuration over to the backup firewall. That's a one-way process. So we're just going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, click on save, and now we've got pfSync configured. Now, as with the primary firewall, we're going to have to configure some firewall rules on our actual backup firewall to allow the HAsync and pfSync traffic. So to do that, we're going to go to Firewall and then to Rules, and then we'll pick our dedicated interface, which for me is HA-Link. Then I'm going to click on the plus sign to add a new rule. I'm going to change the protocol to pfSync here. And I'm going to set the source to HA-Link. And then for the description, I'm just going to call this pfSync traffic. Scroll down and click on Save. Then we're going to add another rule. So I'm going to change the protocol to TCP. I'm going to change the source to HA-Link. For the destination port range, I'm going to pick out HTTPS. And then for the description, I'm going to change this to GUI traffic. Scroll down, click on Save, and now I'm going to click Apply Changes. Now, you might be wondering, well, doesn't the primary actually send its configuration over to the backup? Well, at this stage, the backup isn't really ready, and it would have been basically blocking all of that traffic coming in on the interface. So until you actually get that initial establishment, then it won't work. So we have to at least set up these rules just to get things going. But that's all we need to add as far as firewall rules to our backup firewall. Now, like the documentation suggests, the next thing we're going to do is to actually reboot these firewalls. So for that reason, you want to make sure that your users are prepared, because chances are there's going to be an outage. Now, they don't mention a particular order. So what we're going to do is to actually reboot the primary first, wait until that comes back up again. Then we're going to reboot the actual backup firewall, wait until that one comes back up again, and then we'll do some checks. So I'm going to start with the primary. So I'm connecting to the primary here. We're going to go to Power, and then we're going to select the option to reboot. Click Yes to reboot. And now I'm just going to sit and twiddle my thumbs. Well, the primary firewall is now back up and running. I mean, at least we've got a login prompt. So for that reason, we're going to go over to the backup firewall. I'm going to click on Power, select Reboot, click Yes, and yeah, I'm going to go back to twiddling my thumbs again. Well, the backup firewall is now up and running, so we're going to log into these and we're going to do some checks. So they're both independent firewalls, so I can log into both of them. In other words, you don't just log into the primary as such and control both of them from there. So this is our backup firewall. Looks like I'm putting the wrong password. And this is our primary. So what we can do is some checks. I mean, if we go over to interfaces, then over to virtual IPs, and then status. And this is basically, it's running as the master. So it said it detected a problem, and this one has been demoted to a backup status. Check your link on all interfaces with CARP. If we go over to the backup, we'll check that one then. Look for virtual IPs and then status. So this one's actually saying it couldn't locate any defined CARP interfaces. So that's an interesting start. Okay, so we'll go back to our primary. If we go to System, go to High Availability and click on Status. Now, that is a good sign, because if the primary couldn't communicate with the actual backup, what you'd find is you just get basically the little mouse cursor, if you will, there, it'll just keep spinning around and around. But instead, what we've got here is information about the actual backup firewall, along with details about the services showing that they're up and running and so on. And this to me is where things start to fall apart for redundancy when it comes to OPNsense, because, well, if you go through the documentation, at this point they're suggesting that basically everything's working and everything should have been replicated over to here, and well, it hasn't. I mean, we've got virtual IPs on this firewall, but not on this firewall. They're just completely missing. It doesn't make any sense. It's just gone. There's nothing there. Whereas the documentation seemed to imply, well, this would have all happened automatically, but it doesn't. Now, if you go through the forums, from what I've read, it suggests that at some point the replication was an automated process, but then that got removed and it got turned into a manual process. But I don't see any mention of that in the actual documentation. And that's why I'd flag that issue up about, yeah, this is where things start to fall apart. Because what you're going to have to do is actually make changes on the primary and actually manually sync your config over to the actual backup. So to actually sync our config over, here under where we've got high availability and then status, you can click this option here where we've got synchronize here. We've got like a little cloud here and it says synchronize config to backup. So if I click on that, what I want to see is two tick boxes show up, one for synchronize and one for template. So that has manually synchronized across to the backup. So if I come back to the backup again, if you have a look at our settings, now we've got two interfaces, whereas before we had nothing at all. You go to status, this one, for whatever reason, has decided it's become the master. This one, on the other hand, is just got to wait for this one. If we go to interfaces, virtual IPs, and then status, this one's decided to stay as the backup. So they've basically synced the config over, but the primary, or at least what should be the primary, is currently running as the backup firewall. So yeah, it's a bit of an actual challenge in the sense that this whole process isn't actually automated in one situation, which is a problem. It means every time I want to make configuration changes, I'm going to have to manually sync things across. That's something you need to bear in mind. I mean, just have a look on pfSync nodes, showing one at the moment. This one, if we go over to system, high availability, status. So this one's not configured for high availability. So that's to be expected. So the only issue at the moment really seems to be our virtual IP addresses. So go over to status again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to force a kind of a failover here. So go to interfaces, go to virtual IPs, and go to status, and then I'm just going to say temporarily, you've got a choice of temporarily disable CARP or enter a persistent CARP maintenance mode. That one seems to be the better strategy. So I'll just refresh that. That one's still sitting as the master for some reason. So it's not really making a difference. It's not synchronizing for some strange reason. So I'll take this one back out. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reboot this one. So again, it's going to cause a problem because currently this one's acting as the default gateway. But we'll reboot this one. And we'll see if this one actually takes over at some point. Right, so this one's now taken over as the master. So we just need to wait for this one to come back up. But yeah, I think that's a bit of a letdown because at some point this whole configuration process was automated. You would just make your configuration changes on the primary. They would then get synced over to the actual backup, and that was it. You didn't have to do anything. But now it seems somewhere down the line that took that away and decide it has to be a manual process, you can go through the forums and have a look and see what people are mentioning about it, because they did it for a reason. I just haven't seen an official explanation myself as to why. So let's just refresh this. So this one is currently the master. Go back to system, go back to interfaces rather, virtual IPs, status, and this one's now the backup. So at least it's behaving in the way we now expect. So this is the primary actual firewall. This one's the secondary. So what you expect is that you've got one active firewall as far as CARP is concerned. So this one's responsible for that default gateway. So it's showing a status of a green play button and master, whereas the secondary, that's got a status with a grey play button and backup. So under normal circumstances, this is what you expect to see. One firewall active, one just sitting in a passive or standby mode. Now at this stage, we should have a redundant pair of firewalls. In other words, we've got a primary and we've got a backup. But we need to test that they work, and we also need to test that failover works, because, well, if something goes wrong with the primary here, we want to make sure that our backup firewall will actually be able to take over and we won't have an outage as a result. So what we're going to do is go to the primary here. We'll click on interfaces, go to virtual IPs, and click on status. So from what we can tell, this one is the active firewall. It's got a status of master. Then on the secondary, we do the same. So we'll go to virtual IPs, status. This one's saying it's the backup. So this is the active firewall, the other one's just sitting in standby. Now, one thing I'll point out is earlier on we were getting these error messages reporting problems with CARP. And I did a bit of investigation. I couldn't spot anything on the firewalls. I mean, you've got automatic rules on the interfaces to allow CARP traffic through, so it didn't seem to be that. And I started playing around with the frequency of the advertisement for the interval, of how often these actual CARP messages get sent out, and that wasn't making any difference. And then when I checked the actual underlying Proxmox server, it was reporting problems with OVS by the looks of it. So I've since updated Proxmox and it seems to be more stable. I'm not seeing, I keep checking the actual logs since I've updated this, but I'm not seeing these error messages that I was seeing before. I actually had a similar problem today on my live network system that's using OVS bridges as well, and the virtual machines were just struggling to actually write to disk because the disks are actually on shared storage. So it seems like there was something going wrong with the actual OVS software. So I've since updated to the latest version, and fingers crossed, touch wood, and all the rest of it. It seems to be a lot more stable now. I've also obviously rebooted everything as a result because of, well, upgrading Proxmox itself. But like I say, so far, these do seem to be stable. So I suspect that's what the problem was, not specific to do with OPNsense itself, but actually just the underlying Proxmox network, and more specifically OVS. Anywho, we've got our two firewalls up and running. So what I want to do is I'm going to go to this terminal session that I've got, and we're going to start a ping session going. So it's pinging a computer on the other side of the firewall. So this should be going through the primary. So I'm just going to leave this continuously running. I need to flip back to this one. I'm going to log into that computer as well, because I need to make sure that the state tables are working as well. In other words, what we're going to get is our ping traffic's constantly running. Now that should be able to recover anyway, but if you've got pretty much seamless failover, then an SSH session that we've already got open should carry on working. So we're going to go back to a firewall. Now, there's different ways you can do this. I mean, in a physical environment, for example, you could pull the network cables out of the actual firewall. The backup would detect an outage and then it would take over. It's a bit more tricky in a virtual environment. I can go around and reconfigure the interfaces, for example, to isolate the actual firewall here, for instance. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell it to reboot. I mean, I could reset it. That's equivalent to a power outage in a physical environment. The only trouble is there's then the risk of actually corrupting the actual drive. Now, what I will say is that we should expect this to be a seamless transition from the primary over to the backup, but you've got to be prepared for an outage, especially when you're testing it for the first time. So do make sure that users are actually aware of what's going on and that you're prepared for an actual outage just on the off chance before going any further. But in our case, we're going to just tell it to reboot, in which case it should probably actually tell the backup that there's going to be an outage, but we'll see. So it's not an exact replication of a true outage, but it's close enough without basically trashing the drive, or at least the risk of it. So we'll tell it to reboot itself. I'll say yes. And then it should start to shut down. So at the moment, this is still the backup as far as we can see. If we go back to here, now this is still pinging. So let's go back to a web browser. We'll refresh this one on the secondary. So this is taken over as the active firewall. So that's good to see. So in other words, the firewall is actually rebooting. So let's go back to a terminal session. We'll go to our actual SSH session. So yeah, I'm just hitting return and it's, you know, it's actually still working. So we've had a seamless transition over from the original primary firewall that was active over to the backup firewall, which is now the active firewall. So now what we're going to do is basically wait for the actual primary to come back up, and it has done, so that was quite quick actually. So we'll log back into that. So I'm just checking the log files of Proxmox. It's always a bit concerning when log files suddenly start popping up, because I'm thinking, is it going to be OVS again? There's no sign of those. So we'll go back to our backup, do a refresh. So this one is still saying it's the master. Go back to interfaces, go back to virtual IPs, go back to status. Yeah, I was maybe being optimistic there. It's back again. Now I'm not seeing anything in the log files of Proxmox. That's usually an indication where it's got problems. So what it's done, it's actually demoted itself. It's showing here that the current CARP demotion level is 240. So it's saying it's detected a problem. So for whatever reason, it has an issue. And the two are having trouble communicating. So if I go back to here, yep, it's still the master. I mean, other people have reported similar problems, but I haven't seen a solution to it, shall we say. I mean, I suspected it was just a problem with OVS, but there's no such sign in the log files for Proxmox here, so I don't think it is that. There might be something else. I mean, as far as the actual software goes, let's have a look, just out of curiosity. If I have a look at the status and check for updates, because it was on 24.1 and it's saying it's up to date. Although in this particular case I can't update these anyway, because they're on a completely isolated network anyway. But yeah, it's a feature. When I tried it before, it worked fine. And that's what other people have suggested on an actual forum, is where you basically end up rebooting both firewalls. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the actual firewall here into maintenance mode, at least as far as CARP is concerned. So this is the primary. So at the moment, the secondary is running as the active firewall. And this one should have taken over because of the way it's configured. When you actually set these virtual IPs up, the actual master does actually get priority, or the primary, I should say, gets priority over the secondary or backup. But for some strange reason, there's something definitely going on here where it's not working properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this into maintenance mode, and now it's set that level all the way up to 480. So I'm going to take that back out again of maintenance mode, so it's reset its level back to 0. So if I click on refresh, now this one has taken the actual rule over as the active firewall. If I go over to this one, click refresh, and this one's now the backup firewall. So in my previous testing, that's normally gone pretty smoothly. It's gone backwards and forwards between the two firewalls without issue. But for whatever reason, as Murphy's Law would apply, while I'm recording it, I've got this strange problem where, for whatever reason, CARP isn't working quite the way I would expect it to. Now, bear in mind, this is a virtual environment. Everything's running on a single computer. I mean, the actual computer itself, if I check its stats, I mean, well, just to give you a perspective, it's still got, well, let's just say the CPU load is about under 1% out of 40 CPUs. Memory-wise, we've still got another 40-something gig of RAM. Disk utilization, network utilization are extremely low. So I don't think it's to do with the actual hypervisor, but I can't rule it out. I mean, if I check the log files, I'm not seeing the same error messages that I was seeing before, where network ports were being blocked and opened up again due to spanning tree, which is unusual in a virtual environment, I must admit. But for whatever reason, CARP just isn't functioning the exact way I would expect it to. I mean, as settings go, if we go to the virtual IPs and settings, we just pick one of them out. I mean, there's nothing unusual there. I mean, if you go to advanced mode, that's when you get to see the actual skew that it mentions in the documentation. So you've got to be in advanced mode to see that. So by default, that is set to 0. I mean, if I go over to this one, if I go to its settings, pull that one out. If you go and have a look at its skew is 100. So that's to be expected. In other words, the primary should basically always take over. Whenever it comes back up again, it should take over. But for some strange reason, it's just not doing that. I mean, we'll go back to our sessions, and we're still running our pings and not seeing any outages, even though we've forced it back. I mean, my actual session here is still working, so we haven't lost that. So it hasn't actually caused any problems, but it just means you're kind of feeling it's a bit unreliable, because the way this is supposed to work, or at least the expectation is, the primary firewall should always be the active firewall. The backup's there just as a backup. So you don't really want this to be running as the active firewall for a prolonged period of time. When you make changes to this firewall, and then you sync everything over to the backup firewall. So that's just purely there to cover outages, and that's it. So it's a bit unusual, I must admit. I mean, out of curiosity, I'm going to reboot it again and see if it does the same. I suspect it will. There's definitely something strange going on. Because at one point, this particular one, I'll look at the status of this one. This one actually ended up disabling its interfaces at some strange reason. But that was at the point where, as I say, I was getting these error messages showing up on the actual hypervisor. They have since gone. So it needs a bit further investigation. I mean, as far as a functional redundant firewall though, I mean, it works. It'll fail over to the backup. It just might need a bit of encouragement to bring it back on to the actual primary. Now, normally in a real working environment, that's actually a good thing to a certain respect, because if the primary firewall develops faults, say for instance it's got a link that's constantly flapping up and down, well, you don't want it to come back online and then go offline, then back online, then offline. You want a stable environment. So normally what you would do is actually disable preemption for that reason. But yeah, in this case it's interesting, shall we say. So let's see what it does this time. So I'm not quite sure, as I say, why it's having this issue, because I mean, in my previous testing it worked fine. So this time it's taken over flawlessly by the looks of it. It's not complaining this time. Definitely odd, I'll give it that. I mean, if you go to System, to Log Files and to General, that's where it suggests actually looking and checking for problems. I mean, it's not showing anything there. That's why I'm saying nothing was sticking out for me as to why it didn't do that. I mean, went from backup to master, preempting. So there might be something in the log files. Maybe I'm just gonna have to keep sifting through it and finding, I suppose, anything specifically related to CARP. I mean, what you can do is you can filter messages out. So let's see if we do LAN VIP. Let's filter that if we can. Just mentioning resyncing. It's not saying anything about a specific problem there. Let's try CARP in general. So go right to the end there. So there's 3 pages. Well, there's 4 pages. There's 5 pages. There's a lot of pages. Put it that way. There's a lot of pages. So there might be something in there that gives me a clue as to what's going on, but it seems to be a bit hit and miss. That's the strange thing. That's the worst thing. If you've got like a problem, and if it's blatantly obvious what the problem is, then it's easy to fix. But when it's shall we say, an intermittent problem, that's the worst thing you can run into. Yeah, it's not doing it again. So it did it once after rebooting it. Next time I rebooted it was fine. So it's a bit concerning. But that's one way that seems to fix it. Another way seems to be to reboot the firewalls, bring up the primary first, and then bring up the secondary last. And as I say, it's not the end of the world, because the whole idea is that the backup is only intended there as like a last resort in case the primary does actually fail. Even if it stayed as the active firewall and you had to force the actual active firewall back onto the actual primary firewall, it's not the end of the world. But yeah, it seems to be a feature. That's what I'm going to call it. So let's just double check. Yeah. So the failover has been, I'd say, pretty good. I mean, it's a virtual environment and it's just constantly pinging. It hasn't dropped any packets in the process. And in part, that's to do with the fact that it's polling every second. It's checking every second, sending out CARP messages. They both do. But yeah, as far as redundancy goes, it does actually work, and that's exactly what you want. Now, as I've been mentioning before, for whatever reason, OPNsense doesn't automatically replicate the configuration from the primary firewall across to the backup firewall. So if you make a change on the primary firewall, you're going to have to get into the habit of actually manually syncing the actual configuration over to the backup firewall. Now, you do sometimes get warnings, which I've noticed, but not all the time. So let's say, for example, we're going to go over to the firewall. I'm going to go to rules, and I'm going to pick the LAN interface. Now, I've got a bunch of rules here, which, to be honest, they don't really mean anything because we've got a default rule allowing everything through. But I just wanted to set up some sort of rules that I could just check that we're getting copied across to the actual backup firewall. So what we're going to do is we're going to clone this rule here, which is for HTTPS. But instead, I'm going to change it to HTTP. Click on Save. Now, I'm going to click on Apply. There you go. It's actually saying the changes have been applied successfully. Remember to update your backup server. And then it does actually, give you a link to actually point you in the right direction. But you don't always get that, though, I've noticed. There are some places you can go and make changes, and yeah, you don't get that warning. So really, you've got to get into this habit of manually syncing the changes. Every time you make a change on the primary, make sure that you do follow that path there and make a change. Because I mean, if I go over to the backup, go over to Firewall, and then to Rules, and then onto the LAN interface, you can see we've just got the original 3. So what I need to do is go back to, as it says, System, High Availability, then over to Status, and then click that little cloud button. And then what we should get is 2 ticks to confirm this is all done. If we go back to our backup firewall, do a refresh, now we've got all of the rules. So these are just things you're going to have to get used to. But what I can also do is to actually set up a cron job to at least back up every night, for instance. And it's not recommended to do it too frequently. I mean, if you go through some of the guidelines that ZArmor, for instance, tell you about setting up CARP and redundancy on OPNsense, they're suggesting to set up an actual cron job, but only once per day. So what we're doing is going to System. So this is on the primary. Go to System, then to Settings, and we'll click on cron. Then we're going to add a new job. So we'll click that plus button to add. Now you've got to tell it when you want to do it. So let's say I want to do it at 2 o'clock, for example. And then it wants the actual command. So by default, it's an automatic firmware update. What we're going to do is select the option HA update and reconfigure backup. Then I'm just going to say schedule backup. So you can set this to whatever you like, basically. It's entirely up to you what sort of times. For me, 2 in the morning seems pretty quiet. So I'm going to click on Save. And then that sets up an actual cron job to at least back up the actual backup file. At least I'm going to click on Apply just to make sure. But that gives us an actual cron job. So we should at least be getting the config backed up. But it is still better to get into the habit of manually actually updating it yourself. Now, one way that we can actually monitor if CARP is working is to add a widget to the dashboard. So to do that, we need to be on the primary firewall. In other words, all of our changes have to be done on the primary firewall. And then what we're going to do is click this option up here, Add Widget. And then we're going to select the one right at the top for CARP. And then click on Close. And then, as it says, we've got to click on Save Settings for this to load. And then there we go. At the moment, it's showing itself to be the actual master. So we know we're on the active firewall. This is the master. Now, the thing is, if we go over to our actual backup firewall, there's nothing there. And that's because, well, we've made a configuration change, but yeah, that's been done on the actual primary, but it doesn't automatically sync across to the backup. So in which case, what we're going to do is go to System, High Availability, and then we'll click on Status. Then we're going to sync the configuration by clicking on the cloud. So in other words, where it's got the service synchronized there, we're going to click that one. So it says synchronize config to backup. Click that, and we want to see 2 tick boxes. So we're going to see this dashboard get updated when we refresh. And it's the one that's now showing itself to be the backup. So that's an easier way, I would say, to keep an eye on CARP, just by looking at the actual dashboard, basically. So we're on the primary, and it's saying it's the master. And we're on the secondary, we're seeing that it's the backup. So the reason that's working for me is just because if I go over to System, High Availability and Settings, I opted to synchronize the dashboard. So that's something to bear in mind if you haven't done that. But that's a pretty useful way just to keep an eye on your redundancy. Now, there are going to be times where you need to take the primary firewall out of service. And normally that shouldn't be a problem because, well, we've got our primary firewall here, which is currently running as the active firewall. Then we've got our backup firewall, which is sitting there ready to take over in case something goes wrong. Having said that, you still need to be prepared for a potential outage. So whenever you are going to make some changes and the primary firewall needs to go out of service, then make sure everybody's prepared for a possible outage. But let's say, for example, we want to do a software update, and we want to do this on both firewalls because we want them both running the same code version, just in case there's some odd issue with different code versions being run. Well, what we could do in that particular situation is, well, we're going to go to System, then High Availability, and then Status on our primary firewall here. And we're just going to make sure that the actual configuration on the backup is up to date. So we're doing a manual sync here. The next thing we would do is to go over to the backup firewall and update its actual software. I'm going to do it on this one first because, well, it means we've still got our active firewall, which is still running. We shouldn't have any interruptions while we're actually updating this firewall and while it's being rebooted because, well, this one is the active firewall. So that would be the plan. Update this firewall first. Now, this one doesn't actually need updating, but what we've got over here is a continuous ping running. So what I'm going to do is just actually reboot this firewall. And then we're just going to wait for it to come back up again. Well, the backup firewall is now back up and running. So what I'm going to do is to log into it. Nothing stands out as a problem here. Just looking at the dashboard and go over to our continuous ping. Yep, it's still running. And that's not surprising really because, well, the primary firewall is the active firewall. Now, what we can do, apart from just looking on the dashboard here, is if you go over to System and then High Availability and then Status, it'll come back with details about that backup firewall that we've got, including details about the actual code version. Now, what we want to do is check, well, is the firewall still going to work if it's running on this new code version? So what we can do is to swap over the rules. So to do that on the primary, I'm going to go to Interfaces, Virtual IPs, and then we're going to click on Status here. And then we've got this option here, Enter Persistent CARP Maintenance Mode. In other words, we're really putting the actual firewall into maintenance mode. So we'll click that. You can see that the actual CARP demotion level has gone up to 240, and it's automatically showing us that this is now the backup firewall. If you go over to the actual backup firewall, if I just refresh on the dashboard, I can tell this one's now taken over as the active firewall. So you can now do all of your testing, make sure that things do seem to work while you're running on this particular firewall with this newer code version. Now, if something were to go wrong, you can basically take this one out of maintenance mode and do what you can to fix this particular firewall, which might include installing the older version of code on it, for instance, or trying to look into fixing whatever the bug is and that sort of thing. But as long as this firewall is functioning, then you can leave this one running as the active firewall. Then what you can do is update the code on the actual primary firewall now. So to do that, well, this one again doesn't actually need updating, but you would go to System, Firmware, click on Status and go through the motion of updating the code. But once it's ready, you would reboot the actual firewall. So power reboot in this case, then I'll click on Yes. So now I've rebooted the primary firewall, but if I go back to my continuous ping, yeah, it's still running because now the actual backup firewall is the active firewall. So we just need to wait for this one to come back up again. Well, the primary firewall is now back up and running. So we're going to log back into this one and we'll do some checks to make sure that it seems to be okay. So the services seem to be functioning fine. Links are up. We're still in backup mode. Just double check on the actual backup firewall as well. Yep, this one is still the active firewall. And our continuous ping is still running. The only thing is, if you come back to this primary firewall here, it's sitting in maintenance, which means we don't have any redundancy. So we need to take this out of maintenance mode. So we're going to go to Interfaces. Then we'll click on virtual IPs. Then we'll click on status, and then we'll tell it to leave persistent CARP maintenance mode. So this has gone down from 240 to 0. It's still showing that it's in a status of backup, but if we click on refresh, it's now actually saying that it's the master. Come back to our backup firewall, click on refresh, and now it's the backup firewall. So again, we'll just double check. Yeah, we've got a continuous ping going. So this should be pretty seamless, assuming you don't run into any software bugs, for example. But all the same, these are one of those situations where you still want to be prepared and warn users well ahead of time, just in case there is a potential outage. Even if you have an existing OPNsense firewall, which is running as a standalone firewall, you can still make it redundant. And the setup process for this isn't too difficult. However, there's no warning in the documentation, or at least none that I found, that configuration changes are not synced automatically. Now, this is the potential for you to end up in a situation where the primary firewall fails and users can't get access to resources because the backup firewall is out of date. It's not really a showstopper though, because you can set up a cron job, for instance, to back up the configuration once every day out of hours, and once per day does seem to be the suggested interval. Of course, this is still better than having no redundancy at all, but it would be good to develop the habit of manually syncing the configs every time you make a change. Sometimes you will get warnings to do this, but sometimes you don't, so it's better if manual updates becomes second nature. Now, I did run into some strange problems with CARP while recording this video, but oddly enough, I've only seen these while I was actually recording. It doesn't cause any significant problems and I could work around it, but when this happened, I noticed messages in the log saying pfSync bulk fail. Now, I haven't seen a fix for this, although I have seen comments that changing from unicasting to multicasting in the pfSync configuration might help. Since the documentation shows a unicast setup and the errors weren't frequent, I'd be inclined to leave these settings as is unless the problems worsen. But from what I could tell, this redundancy is definitely something worthwhile setting up. Now, if you find this video to be useful, then do consider subscribing to the channel, as that would really mean a lot to me. But it's also a good indicator to let me know how videos like this are helpful to people such as yourself that are watching. In which case, thank you. On the other hand, if you're not ready for that level of commitment, then I'd really appreciate it if you could press the like button, because that way that'll help to get the video out to other people that might find it useful as well.